y 100 puntos.
Ready.
Good morning, everyone. I'll pass it over to Anna Karim.
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor for us to be here in meaningful dialogue between two countries that share huge common interests. Our gratitude goes to Ambassador Gómez Camacho and Ambassador Clark and their teams for making this possible. We are joining from Ottawa, Canada, and from Connecticut in the USA. My name is Ana Karen Ahumada, and I'm a student at Shawnigan Lake School, and in the future, I want to study architecture.
My name is Laura Bradbury, and I'm a student at the University of Ottawa, an executive member at the Canadian International Council's Ottawa branch.
We will be the moderators of today's youth panel. We are gathered here today to ask, discuss, and learn from the distinguished. This can be a great opportunity to hear and understand the importance of the work they do on a daily basis. We invite you to share your questions and concerns.
We will now introduce the Canadian ambassador and the Mexican ambassador. Ambassador Graeme Clark was designated ambassador to Mexico last year. He was educated in French and English and attended the University of Toronto, the University of Oxford, before joining the Foreign Service in 1989. He's held various positions at headquarters and served as ambassador to Peru and Bolivia, ambassador to the permanent representative to the Organization of American States, and as minister, deputy head of mission in France. He was awarded the Orden del Cel del Peru and the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal.
Ambassador Juan José Gómez Camacho was designated Ambassador of Mexico to Canada in the spring of last year. He's one of the most senior and experienced Mexican diplomats. He joined the Mexican Foreign Service at the age of 24. He has been designated Permanent Representative of Mexico to the United Nations, Ambassador to the European Union, Belgium and Luxembourg, Ambassador to Singapore and the Union of Myanmar and Brunei, among others. He holds a bachelor's degree in law from Iberoamericana University in Mexico City and an LLM from Georgetown University.
To achieve the greatest participation possible, we will apply the following rules. Each person will have 1 minute to address the question. Please state your name, your location, and to whom you are asking your question to. If your question cannot be asked within a minute, we kindly ask you to write it in the chat so that the teams from both embassies can reply to you afterwards. We will try to give everyone a chance to speak, but we'll ask you to also please avoid repeating questions unless it brings additional depth into the conversation. All 3 languages will be used and there will not be simultaneous interpretation. Questions will be answered in the language that they were asked. Please ask whatever is on your mind, but with due courtesy and respect. Thank you everyone for joining.
Buenos días a todos, mi nombre es Ana Karen Ahumada y junto a mi colega Laura Bradbury seremos las moderadoras del panel de hoy. Es un honor participar en este diálogo entre 2 países amigos que tienen grandes intereses en común. Nuestro agradecimiento al embajador Gómez Camacho y al embajador Clark, así como a sus respectivos equipos de trabajo. Nosotras nos estamos conectando desde Ottawa, Canadá, y desde Connecticut en los Estados Unidos. Para lograr la mayor participación posible, vamos a aplicar las siguientes reglas. Cada persona tendrá un máximo de 1 minuto para hacer su pregunta. Por favor, digan su nombre, en dónde se encuentran y a quién va dirigida su pregunta. Si su pregunta no puede ser elaborada en este momento, les agradeceremos enviarla por escrito al chat de esta reunión, para que los equipos de las embajadas puedan responder posteriormente también por escrito. Trataremos de que todos tengan oportunidad de hacer su pregunta, pero les pedimos por favor, no repetir los temas a menos que su pregunta proporcione una mayor profundidad al tema de discusión abordado. Se utilizarán los 3 idiomas y no habrá traducción. Cada embajador responderá en el idioma en el que fue hecha la pregunta. Los invitamos a preguntar todo lo que tengan en mente con el debido respeto y cortesía. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Laura et voici ma collègue Anna Karen. C'est un honneur pour nous de modérer cet important dialogue entre 2 pays émis d'énormes intérêts en commun. Nos remerciements vont à l'ambassadeur Clark, à l'ambassadeur Gómez Camacho et à leur équipe de travail. Nous sommes à Ottawa au Canada et à Connecticut aux États-Unis. Pour voir la plus grande participation possible, nous appliquerons les règles suivantes. Chaque personne disposera d'un maximum d'une minute pour poser sa question. Veuillez indiquer votre prénom, le lieu où vous êtes situé et à qui s'adresse votre question. Si vos questions ne peuvent pas s'élaborer dans une minute, s'il vous plaît, envoyez-les dans la boîte de chat pour que les ambassades puissent y répondre ensuite. Nous allons essayer de donner à chacun le temps pour poser vos questions. Cependant, nous vous prions d'éviter la répétition des mêmes sujets, sauf si votre question donne de la profondeur à la conversation en cours. Les trois langues seront utilisées et il n'y aura pas d'interprétation simultanée. Chaque ambassadeur répondra dans la langue de la question posée. On vous invite donc à poser tout type de questions avec courtoisie et respect. Merci beaucoup de votre participation.
We can now start with questions. You can unmute your mic, say your name, where you're from, and who your question is directed to.
Just to get the ball rolling here, I have a tough question directed at Ambassador Gómez Camacho. How are you doing today?
Yes, I am listening.
Perfect. How do you expect the North American relationship to change after President-elect Joe Biden is inaugurated in January?
Good question, as you said. Before I said that, or answer that just quickly, both of you mentioned that the idea is that the audience, all the young people that are participating today, learn from us. But I would say rather that is exactly the opposite. We both are extremely interesting to learn from the youth, to learn from all of you what are your wishes, your aspirations, the challenges, how you see things, and how or what is it, what in your view we should be doing. The future is in your hands, and I think adult people or previous generations like ours have to follow you. On the question, during these last 4 years in the US, or these 4 years in the US, created certain conditions that made Canada and Mexico become more aware how much we need each other, how much we should rely on each other, and therefore how much we need to build together a prosperous two countries, but also more prosperous region. With the election, or the recent election in the US and the new administration coming next month, I would expect first things to go back to a certain degree of tradition and more normality, if you like. Last 4 years were anything but normal in that sense. So I would expect them to go back to more normality. And for us would be a big challenge for Canada and Mexico to, despite going back to more orthodox ways, not to miss the point that despite things changing in the US, we do not or should not miss the ball. The ball is what I mentioned, that we both still need to rely on each other, still have to build together, still have to work together. If things are easier, more constructive in the US, all the better. Then we are able to do that even in a stronger way. So that's how I interpret the future now.
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sorry, I'll pass it over to Anna Kerman, who will ask the next question to Ambassador Clark.
Okay, so as you are both aware, the pandemic has a unique effect on youth. What are your ideas regarding the economy to the benefit of the youth?
So that's a question for me, or maybe it's a question for Juan Jose as well. First of all, I'm really delighted to take part in this dialogue. We've had one in the past, and it was an extremely rich session. And I agree with Juan Jose. We're here to learn from you. Yes, we have experience, and yes, we've done all sorts of things in our lives. But connecting ourselves to your preoccupations and your concerns and your aspirations, I think, is an incredibly useful opportunity for both of us. And Juan Jose and I have these sessions often, not with youth, I mean, but these sort of virtual sessions to talk about the Canada-Mexico relationship or some theme within that relationship. So we enjoy tag teaming in these contexts. A few thoughts about your very relevant question, and the first question, I mean, the first aspect is, we're living a terrible time. We're living this terrible pandemic, which is having an impact health-wise, but also on our mental health, and has perhaps foreclosed certain opportunities for us, whether we are young or old or in the labor market or about to enter the labor market. So I would say that how we deal with the pandemic and how we deal with the social and economic aspects of the pandemic has to be, those aspects have to actually absolutely be top of mind going forward. And you'll all know what the Canadian government is doing in those terms. I can only speak for mine in saying that obviously that's the top priority. Second point I'd put on the table, I mean, there's the contextual problem of the pandemic, and we will resolve it, right? Together we will resolve it. We will get through this. Yes, it's going to be tough for a generation of students who haven't been able to be physically present in a classroom or after the class, which is the most interesting part really of education. I mean, a lot of people say that education takes place outside of the purviews of the classroom, right? But afterwards, when you comment on such and such a aspect of a course or a lecture. So there's the contextual thing immediately, but then there's the challenge, I think, of your generation, of my generation, which is the environment and climate change. And I think that the challenge for us going forward is going to be how we deal with that and how we green our economy. There are some people who say that that the preoccupation for the environment is a trade-off with economic growth. That's not the perspective, I think, of a lot of people who see focusing on the environment and greening the economy as a real opportunity going forward for the next generation. So those are two thoughts. There are many other thoughts, but those are two thoughts that come to mind at the moment. But I reiterate, I think back to my own time at school or at university, and to think that most of you are losing a year, right, of those sort of social interactions which are so critical. My heart goes out to you. That's not easy. We have our challenges as diplomats and as public servants, but they're nothing compared to what you are living.
Thank you, Ambassador Clark. I am sure that the environment and the economic resiliency topics will come up further in our conversation today. We do have a question from Sarisha ER. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. If you would like to come to the floor and ask your question, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, and that's okay, no worries. So my question is around human rights, and I think that's something that folks are quite concerned about, particularly young people like myself. And so I'm wondering, what action are both the Canadian and Mexican governments taking to make public your support for the legitimate efforts of threatened human rights defenders in Chihuahua and everywhere else that they're under attack? And what action are you taking for compliance with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights? And just a little bit of context is that Amnesty International delivered over 61,000 messages from supporters expressing concern over Indigenous land defenders who had been killed, like Julian Carrillo, Carrillo in northern state of Chihuahua. And so looking to see what justice is being called for and what actions both governments are looking to take as a public sort of stance on supporting human rights.
Thank you for your question. Can I just ask where you're from, where you're calling from today?
Yeah, I'm in Ottawa, the unceded territory of the Algonquin.
Thank you very much. And who was your question directed to, if I may ask?
I think to both of us.
Both.
To
Yeah.
both of us.
You are both welcome to
Juan
answer.
Jose, do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Whatever.
I'll start. Since Chihuahua was the first point. Thank you for the question. And human rights protection is one of the most challenging duties that we all have around the world. And indeed, human rights have not yet taken hold globally as they should. And I couldn't agree more with you on your concern. Canada and Mexico have, not now, for years, really for years, been working together on human rights, both in the multilateral front, in the UN, negotiating precisely these declarations and instruments you have mentioned, always with one goal in mind. And on this, I think I speak also for Canada, which is it has always been to strengthen and to raise to the maximum possible global human rights standards, so as those standards agreed globally can be brought back home and complied with. And in the case of Mexico, we have always tried to use these international standards, these international instruments as a tool for change, as a tool to make sure that internally we can change. In the case of human rights defenders, it's an issue. It has always been a pressing issue. It's a very pressing issue for this current administration. And there are different institutions now, both in the Secretaría de Gobernación as well as in the Fiscalía General de la República, that are precisely focused on that. Is a priority. And not only because we have to protect the human rights of human rights defenders, but because human rights defenders play a fundamental role in ensuring both that human rights are protected in the country broadly, and also that our democracy is strengthened. So despite the challenges that are very clear that we have there, rest assured that we are really working very strongly on that. Second, Canada and Mexico, as I was saying, always have had this human rights partnership. And just precisely today, human rights, we have, there will be to be virtual, meeting between the two governments, Global Affairs Canada and other institutions, Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other institutions, to discuss precisely human rights. Human rights, how can we strengthen our cooperation? How can we work together stronger outside? But also, how can we profit from each other in strengthening our own challenges? And on this, Canada has capacities, has expertise that can be used in Mexico. So, for example, if I can make a little disclosure, one of the issues we are working precisely these days now with the Canadian authorities is to put together a technical cooperation package on forensic services, for example, so as to make sure that Canadian expertise on forensics can be taught in Mexico, learned, acquired by our forensic services with the aim of strengthening our capacity to protect human rights. Forensics is very central. And on indigenous peoples, I can't add too much more. Is a priority issue for Canada, is a priority issue for Mexico, reivindication of indigenous rights, reivindication of the rights of indigenous to their land, to their culture, to their environment, to their entourage. And again, is another area where both governments are really working on a very often basis, if I can put it this way.
Can I jump in as well? An excellent question, a relevant question. a tough question. And as Juan Jose has just indicated, yes, we are having a dialogue today on this very question. It's being done government to government. It's not in a public venue, but it's a very significant part of our relationship. And let me just give you a sense of how it works. You know, it's not a question of Canada pointing the finger at others. Too often we've done that in the past, and I'm not sure that gets us very far. It gives us a certain rhetorical and emotional satisfaction if we're looking at the situation, and I'm not talking necessarily about Mexico. I'm talking about other situations that could take place around the world. But it's good that we look at ourselves in the mirror before we look at others. And the way that the consultations are taking place, I don't know whether you've seen the agenda, Juan Jose, but you know, it begins with a section about human rights in Canada. And you know, we are not without stain in that regard, particularly when it comes to Indigenous people, particularly when it comes to the vulnerabilities that the pandemic has revealed in our society among the elderly, among people of color. You know, we have our work to cut out in our own society, and we have to deal with that. You know, and I take as one of my precedents for this the speech that the Prime Minister gave at the United Nations a couple of years ago. I don't know whether you remember that, but he spoke exclusively about Canada's record in terms of Indigenous peoples, not lament historical things and wrongs that we have to right. Our government is committed to this, and I think we'll all see that despite all the commitments that our government has made, the road ahead is still complicated. It's still difficult, and there are still situations in Canada that merit further attention and further investment on the part of governments. So, you know, what I'm trying to say with my answer to this question is what we're trying to do in terms of our dialogues with other countries is not to point fingers, is not to embarrass, but to see whether in pragmatic and practical ways we can help affect positive change. That's really the business of diplomacy. And yes, you can look at the embassy's Twitter feeds, and yes, there are tweets, and there are preoccupations expressed on any number of situations. But what counts for me is the real progress that can be made between two countries which are friends, which are allies, and which share not identical histories in terms of the relationship between European conquerors, as it were, and Indigenous peoples who were here before they arrived. But there are common elements that can be addressed and that we can dialogue on. So that's my response.
Gracias, embajadores. Ahora tenemos una pregunta de Karen Cardona. Si nos puedes indicar de dónde te conectas y a quién va dirigida tu pregunta, por favor.
Hi everyone, I'm connecting from Mexico City, but I work and live usually in Toronto, Ontario. So I really have like a very strong connection between both countries. And I actually want to keep talking about like human rights, especially because my area, I studied politics in Canada, so definitely great experience. And I currently work around the human rights sector. But it's interesting to see Ambassador Juan Jose talking about like how important it is to defend human rights defenders when human rights defenders ourselves have felt during this specific government a very clear repression and sort of persecution, and especially talking about women's rights, which is also a huge problem and something that affects like relationships between countries, that affects people and women who live and have relationships with both countries. It's a huge issue, and we have seen femicides increasing in Mexico this year with the pandemic. We have seen violence against women increase with the pandemic, and at the same time we see a reduction on the budget for women's rights at the federal level, a huge reduction. And when women go go to streets and start protesting, we have seen great repression. Just 2 weeks ago, we saw shootings from the police officers in Cancun against peaceful protesters. And that's terrible in one of the most touristic places that many Canadians go and visit. We have seen repression in Mexico City with very strong police violence. I mean, I've been there in León, in many states in Mexico. So I would like to know if there's opportunities, I don't know, for the Canadian government to be more outspoken about this sort of repression that women were living from the Mexican government, and that it's and overall the violence that keeps increasing, and that definitely affects women who have relationships with both countries, and that it affects us all, right, economically speaking, and the development of good relationships between both countries. So that's my question or my comment. I don't know if it's a question or a comment.
Look, I'm happy to jump in, and I missed part of your question because there was a connectivity issue. You said something really interesting about the impact the pandemic has had on feminicides and family violence, and we're very aware of that. We have a small fund that we manage at the embassy, and so we've been able to support a number of programs to deal directly with family we're supporting. So we're conscious of this, and we're hopeful also that partnering with certain NGOs that we can actually have a measurable impact. But I'll come back also to something that I said in my previous question. And by the way, Karen, aren't you emblematic of that Canada-Mexico relationship? You're sort of emblematic of that sort of Canada-Mexico relationship, and that's wonderful to see, and I congratulate you for that. And I wish too, this is a big aside, that when I was your age, I had chosen to study in Mexico for a year rather than, go off to Europe. So that's great. But let me come back to a more serious aspect, and that is, what is actually going to work? How are you actually going to make a difference? And, sometimes speaking softly and privately is more compelling and more effective than launching some verbal attack that will get people's backs up. The business of diplomacy is not simply to have a megaphone. The business of diplomacy is to work behind the scenes to affect change and improve things, and that's part of the Canada-Mexico relationship, I'd say. So if the Mexicans have an issue with us, they'll talk privately to us about it, rather than necessarily go public. So it's a question of approach. It's not that concerns aren't broadly shared. It's perhaps a question of how you approach a problem and how you make progress on a file. Juan Jose?
Yeah, thank you, Graeme. I can see perfectly well where your concern comes from. I think it's a very serious concern, and of course, it's absolutely a legitimate concern. The only area where, if I may, I would propose a comment more than disagreeing with you is in the use of government repression term. I've seen throughout years doing precisely human rights, both in Mexico and outside. And I understand why, of course. I'm not challenging it as such. It's the immediate, there is always this natural tendency to use the term repression from the government against this or that group whenever something happens. And I don't think in these cases that you are mentioning, that's exactly the best way to describe it, to say that there is government repression against human rights defenders. Honestly, Karen, I think is a too broad assertion that I honestly don't share. Yes, there are many challenges. Yes, human rights defenders have been facing for years enormous challenges. Yes, it is the responsibility of the government to make sure that that doesn't happen anymore. And that's where we are working. But that doesn't necessarily or should not be translated into government repression or government persecution. It's really, it is far more complex and there are different things. Same goes for women's rights and violence against women. Just a few days ago, the president himself acknowledged that there is still a serious issue there. I couldn't agree more with you that during the pandemic and the lockdown, violence against women has increased. By the way, not only in Mexico, everywhere, including Canada, is a terribly dramatic social phenomenon that we need to find a way to address. Demonstrations, whenever the police, a police officer, a police commander, someone in charge of a specific police operation around demonstrations, if something happens as the incident that was very bad that you mentioned recently, there is this misconduct, it has to be investigated as they are being investigated. So again, one thing is to acknowledge that there is, or the state, the government has a responsibility to A, prevent these things from happening, and B, investigating and prosecuting this on the one hand. And another entirely thing is to say that all this is the result of government repression. And third, the question of resources. We have a challenge of resources now. Overall, it's not a political decision to reduce budget to make sure that human rights are no longer protected, or that women's rights are less important, or that the rights of defenders are less of a priority. Is that because of the pandemic and the very dramatic fall of the Mexican economy and therefore the budget, the government has no choice but to reduce dramatically resources, not only for human rights or for everything. And the priority now is health. The priority is now to try to help some businesses, so employment, not businesses, employment, workers, as the president has been saying, to help the poor. And we can agree or disagree on the priorities themselves, fair enough. But it's not the result of a political decision not to support X or Y group, or even worse, a political decision to leave some groups unprotected. This is just the result of a very complex economic budget times for the country. Hopefully, as we are seeing already now, the economy will start picking up as it is now. And hopefully, again, resources will come back, or the capacity of the government to keep strengthening resources for these very important things like the ones you are mentioning will come back. But the context here and understanding well what measures and why are being taken is very, very important. Again, I'm not challenging what you said. On the contrary, I'm very happy to see that someone as young as you are, and the previous question as well, is so concerned for human rights. That to me is gold, that your generation has a different DNA in terms of human rights than previous generations. This is critical. What I'm just trying to say is to put some context for your own analysis.
Could I say something very quickly? And thank you so much for your very great response. And I think, I mean, my only sort of comment to you, because you're in such like a great position, right, of this great relationship with Canada, is that I do feel, and coming from the movement, being connected with very grassroots groups from feminist groups in Mexico, indigenous groups in Mexico, we are feeling repression. And I want to be very clear about that. And maybe, like you say, it's a different type of analysis of feeling it, but we're working sort of on the forefront, we are feeling it. So I do think there needs to be more opportunity between the government and our groups to talk, right? To come to the table, to be able to sort of have channels to talk about this. So like you say, that we don't feel it like that. Maybe it's not the goal of the government, and it's not, like you say, something very clear and targeted, but we are feeling it. And I just want to raise that because it's a concern that we all have. And I just wanted to say that. Thank you so much. I will not take over time, but
fair enough. Point taken. And I think there is a clear effort of the government to try to talk. But what is really important to me in this conversation is that you understand that this is not government repression. Government repression has a completely different, broader meaning and context than the one we are having. But point taken, absolutely. And I think you're totally right in this demand, request, hope for dialogue. Couldn't agree more with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ambassadors. Thank you, Karen. We now have a question from Ruben Leiva. Please go ahead.
Hola, muchas gracias. Mi nombre es, Rubén Leiva, soy de la ciudad de Puebla, México, y me gustaría preguntarles sobre programas de inmigración. Sé que ahorita por COVID estuvo suspendido y en tal caso pues se bajó mucho, ¿no? Hablaban, me parece que salió en octubre, una publicación de una inmigración inmensa, por decirlo de alguna forma, que abarca desde el 2021 al 2023. Y también esto me enteré hace como 2-3 meses aproximadamente. Y vi que el programa, uno de los más sencillos en teoría, o menos difíciles más bien, es el programa del Atlántico. Me gustaría saber un poco más acerca del tema de inmigración. Y bueno, pues es por eso que igual les agradezco mucho de su tiempo. Y bueno, con su respuesta. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, estaba a la espera de una pregunta de ese tipo, ¿no? Y la verdad es que antes de la pandemia teníamos un flujo muy importante de estudiantes hacia Canadá. Yo creo que las últimas cifras que he visto tratan de 24,000 jóvenes mexicanos que estudian en Canadá cada año, o en cortos programas bastante cortos de 2 o 3 meses, en un enfoque muy particular, un programa de idiomas, o algo más largo, ¿no? Una maestría o algo así. Entonces, esta era la situación antes de la pandemia. Ahora tenemos desafortunadamente esta pandemia, que es un poco un tema en todas las respuestas, todas las preguntas que hemos tenido esta mañana, Juan José, yo diría. Sí. Y el impacto de esta pandemia es que, en primer lugar, la frontera canadiense está cerrada, ¿no? Por razones sanitarias. Solamente en los canadienses que regresan a Canadá o casos de emergencia o de urgencia puede entrar a Canadá en ese momento. Entonces, ese es el primer impacto. El segundo impacto es que el VAC, el famoso VAC, ¿no? Que es la mecánica de acordar una visa a tal o tal candidato, el VAC está cerrado por ahora. Me acaban de informar que pronto podría reabrir sus puertas de manera bastante limitada. Entonces sería una oportunidad para los que tienen interés en estudiar en Canadá o de emigrar a Canadá, de hacer su pedido a través del VAC. Tercer punto, Rubén, si tal vez este no es el espacio para tener una conversación muy profunda sobre tus planes, pero si podrías poner tus datos en el chat, alguien del equipo de la embajada podría estar en contacto contigo para para dialogar o para orientarte un poco mejor. Y la última cosa que voy a decir en ese campo, a mí me fascina la idea de que haya jóvenes mexicanos que quieren estudiar en mi país. Me parece fabuloso, ¿no? Pero me gustaría ver algo de reciprocidad, me gustaría ver más canadienses, jóvenes canadienses, estudiando en México, y como lo acabo de decir en otra respuesta a otra pregunta, me hubiera gustado hace 40 años o 30 años estudiar en México, para conocer la dinámica de un país que es vecino, pero que es muy diferente de la realidad de mi país. Y el futuro, voy a decir un cliché, ¿no? Que el futuro de la relación entre Canadá y México son ustedes, ¿no? Entonces, si podemos facilitar esa reciprocidad, sería fabuloso. Perdón, hablé demasiado.
No, déjame complementar. Gracias, Rubén, por la pregunta, y coincido naturalmente 100% con lo que acaba de decir Graeme, especialmente con el último punto. Precisamente a mí también me da mucho gusto ver un gran número de jóvenes que quieren venir a Canadá, que están viniendo a Canadá, y lamento profundamente que muchos de ustedes han tenido o la pandemia ha sacrificado sus perspectivas de venir a Canadá, que es un gran país. Igual tenemos que trabajar más para que jóvenes canadienses efectivamente vayan a México, porque los números son todavía demasiado pequeños para lo que deberían ser. Déjame, sin embargo, agregar una reflexión, aprovechando el viaje, como diríamos en México, de tu pregunta. Hay un gran interés en general y creciendo, y yo creo que producto de la pandemia y la situación económica, de muchos mexicanos, especialmente jóvenes, pero no solamente, que quieren emigrar a Canadá, quieren buscar mejores oportunidades en Canadá, lo cual a mí me da gusto, me parece muy bien, coincido, este es un gran país, y además es un país que no solamente ofrece muchas oportunidades, sino que es muy generoso en su sistema de migración para que personas de otros países puedan venir, además de que en Canadá se necesitan. Entonces, digamos, la mesa está puesta. Mi única sugerencia en ese tema sería, para todos ustedes que quisieran eventualmente o que están pensando en la posibilidad de Canadá, háganlo bien. No se confundan y traten de hacerlo por las puertas equivocadas. Hay un reto grande en Canadá, México en Canadá, de un gran número de mexicanos que con una aspiración legítima, con ganas de venir a Canadá, de construir, de contribuir y de construirse a sí mismos un futuro mejor o más próspero, han optado por las vías no correctas, es decir, o hacerlo de manera indocumentada, o hacerlo a través de tocando la puerta del refugio, etcétera, etcétera. Y eso siempre es contraproducente. Nunca funciona. Más pronto que tarde se acaba y tienen que regresar a nuestro país. Como digo, el Canadá es generoso, el sistema de migración es muy generoso, hay muchas alternativas planteadas para que puedan venir. Me da mucho gusto ver que quisieran venir y que lo hagan. Simplemente insisto, toquen la puerta correcta, háganlo bien, sigan los procedimientos de Canadá, sigan lo que la ley de Canadá migratoria señala, consulten a la Embajada de Canadá, consulten a la Embajada de México, infórmense bien, háganlo bien, y les aseguro que van a ser muy felices en este país.
Completamente de acuerdo, Juan José. Gracias por tu último mensaje.
Les agradezco mucho por sus amables y animosas respuestas. La verdad es que esa era la respuesta que esperaba, sinceramente, y mucho más, ¿no? Muchas gracias igual por sus consejos. Y sí, voy a enviar igual mi correo, mis datos de contacto. Y bueno, agradecerles por su tiempo nuevamente y muchísimas gracias. Esperamos.
Thank you, Ruben. response. I know that Sebastian and Paulina had similar questions regarding visas and student support, and I hope that the ambassadors were able to answer all of your questions. I'll now open the floor to Alfredo to ask his question. Hi, Alfredo.
Hello, and thank you both ambassadors, the moderators, and the Mexican Embassy for hosting this very interesting contemporary topic. It's very, very much of interest to young people, as everyone has shown up and demonstrated. So my question centers around the pandemic. So in the context of the pandemic and its unique effects on youth, whether it's with dismal job opportunities in both countries, lost education experiences, or stagnation in development of youth human capital development, what are the areas, in both of your opinions, where Canada and Mexico can improve areas in their relationship around youth to allow for a stronger recovery for both countries? So for example, could it be increased educational exchanges with Canadians studying in Mexico, which what we just discussed in the last question, language programs that could improve intercultural connections, or anything else that may be of relevance in both your opinions? Thank you for this.
Alfredo, thank you for your question. As I said previously in Spanish, it's fascinating how the theme running through this entire conversation is the pandemic, whether it's violence against women, opportunities for youth, impact on the North American economy. It's the theme, right? It's the theme of the moment. That's what we should all be focusing on, whether we're students or diplomats or in government or in business. So I agree with you. I guess the first thing I'd say is, this is the pandemic and its impacts is not something that countries can do in isolation from others. I'm a diplomat, so I believe in working with other countries, and I believe in the constant dialogue that will slowly, progressively move things forward. And I think that there is a real opportunity to come back to the first question I think that was asked of Juan Jose, as the North American world changes with a new administration in Washington. I think that dealing with the lessons learned of the pandemic and dealing with the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, including on youth, but not just on youth, right? I mean, yes, youth can be a priority. Maybe it's the top priority, but there are other priorities. And so I see a real opportunity for the three countries of North America. After all, it is our region, it is our neighborhood, to look very seriously at what we can do to coordinate our efforts better, to ensure that, frankly, that there's a rapid economic bounce back from the situation that we're living at the moment, and perhaps also to enlarge that to a broader hemispheric discussion. I mean, the whole of the world, the whole of the Americas is suffering terribly from this pandemic. And as I said, it's not dealing with these situations is not something that countries can do by themselves. We have to work together, whether it's on the COVAX facility for access to vaccines, or whether it's on economic stimulus, whether it's on lessons learned for the next pandemic, because there's going to be another pandemic. We're going to be in this situation again, and governments and societies had better be ready to deal with that situation. And, to come back also to a comment that Juan Jose made, give us your thoughts, give us your suggestions. Let it not simply be rhetorical from our part. I'd be very interested in hearing, your concrete suggestions as what we could do over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months on that front. So those are just a few sort of thoughts on this. I'll pass it over to Juan Jose, who always has things to say that are interesting.
I don't know if interesting, but agreed completely with what Graeme said. And I just add another reflection probably. There is a big concern about the youth, and also the perception that probably the youth could be the biggest victims of the pandemic, in the sense that the young are facing challenges for employment, for example, or younger kids or children not being able to go to school, having to take lessons on Zoom, not having the normal human contact that otherwise they should at school, etc., etc., etc. And all these certainly may be true. However, I don't know if it's my almost optimismo enfermizo, but I understanding all this, I see enormous opportunities for the youth now as a result of the pandemic. Because I think, the way I see it, all of you are becoming, well, first, as Graeme has been saying, the pandemic is all over. It's one of the most transformational events we have seen in generations. It's not only a disease that we will deal with now that there is a vaccine and so on and so forth, but it's fundamentally transformational. It's changing the parameters of life, of work, of social relations, of politics, of economics, of everything. So back to the reflection I wanted to share with you, or I was sharing with you. I think all of you living through this massively transformational phenomenon and very challenging will be one of the most first resilient generations we have ever had. Fundamentally resilient. Second, the pandemic is also bringing very interesting changes, because the human mind or human creativity, human ability to deal with challenges is infinite. And we are seeing it at play. So we are seeing incredible changes in technology now, for example. We are, with the vaccines, I'm sure you are following it. If not, follow it, because it's fascinating to see the two vaccines, particularly two, the one from Moderna and the other from Pfizer, which are the result of completely new technologies that will have an enormous impact on health, on the capacity of humanity to deal with other diseases, probably cancer, etc. Technologies, biotechnology that will be used on other things. The way we work is changing, and I have the impression that despite this Zoom life is weird and sometimes exhausting, it's also being very efficient. We are being very effective. It's super interesting what is happening. So my point to conclude is that I see enormous opportunities for all of you. I think, again, that you will profit from changes. I think you will be one of the most innovative generations ever. And again, I think you will be one of the most resilient generations ever. And all that together will bring forward enormous positive changes for the world and for humanity. And Canada, Mexico couldn't add to what Graeme said. There's a lot of things to do. And precisely one of the reasons why we are hosting this conversation with you, which is the second, and there will be many more to follow, is precisely because one of the guiding principles, or the compass for what we do, have to be your needs, have to be your wishes, have to be your aspirations. You have to guide us. Your voices have to be raised and have to be heard clearer and louder in what we do in government.
If I could just jump in, Juan Jose, what a wonderful message. Just to complete my thought on COVID and youth, I forgot to say that our embassy is going to be launching a youth and COVID initiative in January. So watch our social media for more information on that. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that optimism and connecting it with the precarious situation youth are facing right now.
Thank you, ambassadors. Ahora tenemos una pregunta de Dante Cadena.
Hello. Yeah.
Adelante, Dante.
Okay.
Adelante,
gracias.
te escuchamos.
Gracias. Bueno, primero pues muchas gracias por este tipo de espacios para poder platicar con ustedes. Yo soy Dante Cadena de Querétaro, soy consultor de negocios, y algo que siempre he admirado de Canadá es que Canadá siempre ha visto la diversidad como un valor agregado, ¿no? lastimosamente en México he sufrido más de racismo que en otro de los 7, en cualquiera de los otros 7 países que he trabajado. Pero bueno, es algo de lo que admiro mucho de Canadá y pues estoy un poco celoso y ojalá México algún día sea así, referente a temas de diversidad y bueno, e inclusión. Mi pregunta va más sobre la agenda de tecnología. Sabemos que, al menos los que estamos en tema de negocios, sabemos que Canadá pues, se está volviendo un referente mundial en cuanto a Big Data, Artificial Intelligence, Robot Process Automation y todas estas tecnologías que están cambiando la forma de trabajo, están cerrando empleos, están creando unos nuevos y básicamente están impactando en toda la calidad de vida. Referente a esas tecnologías, ¿existe algún plan bilateral entre México y Canadá para democratizar la tecnología, para fomentar la educación, para fomentar la inversión? ¿Qué hay respecto a esas tecnologías?
Bueno, ese es uno de los temas del momento, ¿no? La inteligencia. Hola, ahora te veo, Dante. Gracias por la pregunta. Tema muy importante y francamente no sé si hay una iniciativa bilateral en ese sentido. Como tú dices muy bien, Canadá es un líder, ¿no? En términos de inteligencia artificial, especialmente en Montreal. Pero con muchísimo gusto podríamos averiguar y si nos puedes poner tus datos en el chat, vamos a ver lo que podemos localizar en términos de información. Pero adopto también tu sugerencia, ¿no? Tal vez es tema que se podría explorar en el contexto de la relación bilateral que tenemos. Juan José, tal vez sabes más que yo.
Eso nunca. Agrego algunas cosas. Bueno, primero déjame decir algo muy personal. Me da mucho gusto que vengas de un estado tan bello como el de Querétaro. Yo oigo el nombre de Querétaro, me remonto a mi infancia, porque cuando viajábamos en coche de la Ciudad de México a Guanajuato, de donde es mi familia materna, invariablemente nos parábamos en Querétaro a comer carnitas. Ese era el viaje y de regreso también. Mi recuerdo de Querétaro siempre es ese. Y segundo, además, que el estado de Querétaro es un estado increíblemente presente en Canadá. La relación Querétaro, particularmente Quebec, es, como sabes, derivado del gran sector aeroespacial que en Querétaro se ha desarrollado, la presencia de una empresa tan impresionante y tan importante como Bombardier, pero sobre todo en Querétaro, en donde Quebec y Bombardier han sido parte de esta tan rápida y extraordinaria modernización del estado de Querétaro. Entonces, chapeau por todo eso. Segundo, como dijo Graeme, Canadá es uno de los países que se han ido convirtiendo en pioneros en el tema de inteligencia artificial y en general tecnología. La verdad, muy impresionante. Y lo que nosotros estamos tratando de hacer es traer jóvenes como tú, precisamente, de fomentar que jóvenes como ustedes, interesados en la tecnología, puedan venir a México, a Canadá, a estudiar, a hacer posgrados, a hacer maestrías, a tener prácticas en un montón de empresas que están ocurriendo y además que están existiendo, que se están desarrollando aquí y además estamos tratando en general de que haya que en la relación bilateral el tema tecnológico esté más presente. Y finalmente una reflexión sobre tu primer comentario sobre el racismo y la discriminación. Sí tenemos en México un problema histórico de profundo racismo y discriminación. Eso yo creo que haríamos muy mal no reconocerlo o no reconociéndolo. Por años, ya son varios años, precisamente por eso se creó la CONAPRED y se ha tratado de hacer un gran esfuerzo para abordar el tema de la discriminación. Primero, reconociendo que lo teníamos. En México, por décadas, jamás se reconoció que tuviéramos un problema de racismo o discriminación. Nunca nos poníamos el saco históricamente cuando este tema se discutía. pero ya son varias décadas en donde finalmente, afortunadamente, reconocimos que tenemos un problema estructural profundo. Has escuchado al presidente de la República. El presidente de la República, yo creo que no ha habido presidente de la República más vocal precisamente en el tema del racismo y de la discriminación, que además ha sido históricamente dirigida a dos grupos, a los indígenas y a los afromexicanos, por ejemplo. Apenas empezamos, es impresionante que para nosotros el concepto afromexicano es muy reciente. Es como si apenas hubiéramos descubierto que en México hay afrodescendientes o afromexicanos, y todavía en buena parte de la población es un concepto que termina de asentarse en la mente. Pero lo que te puedo decir es, siendo mucho mayor que tú, obviamente, que la evolución que hemos tenido en México en materia de concientización del racismo, de la discriminación de parte de la sociedad mexicana es muy impresionante. En términos, aun cuando sigue siendo mala, aun cuando sigue existiendo, aun cuando ya no debería existir, pero son fenómenos complejos de sacar de raíz, sí te puedo decir que el México que tú vives, al México de hace 20, 30, 40 o 50 años, en términos de inclusión, no discriminación, es otro. Tenemos mucho por avanzar, sí, pero el país ha avanzado y estoy convencido que sigue avanzando. Y creo que en esta administración va a avanzar más por el hecho que el presidente de la República sea tan vocal y que la mayor parte de la población lo escuche como lo escucha. Yo creo que ahí es en donde va a estar el clic del verdadero cambio.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. We have one last question before we wrap up. The last question from Facebook Live, Kiara said, or asked, there are many scams and frauds on the internet to hook people from Mexico to come to Canada. This is organized crime. What are both governments doing to prevent it? So this question is for both ambassadors.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I didn't understand it completely.
Yes, okay. There are many scams and frauds on the internet to hook people from Mexico to come to Canada. This is organized crime. What are both governments doing to combat this? This is from Kiara on Facebook Live.
Thank you. So I'm happy to share a few thoughts. I mean, this is obviously of concern to the Canadian government, is the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is if you follow us on social media, you'll see that we have very robust advice to prospective candidates who want to come to Canada to, follow the established channels and ensure that the information they're getting is from the correct sources. And this comes back, I think, to a very good response that Juan José gave a couple of questions ago in Spanish. And he was saying to young people and students who are interested in traveling or studying in Canada to do it through the established channels. So I think we can repeat that message, and government to government, of course, the whole issue of migration and immigration is top of mind in the discussions that we have government to government. And so it is something that we take seriously, both in terms of the relationship that we have government to government, but also in terms of our public stance. In terms of the advice that we provide to people who, for any number of reasons, want to travel or study or settle in Canada. Juan José, I don't know whether you...
I agree. I agree entirely with you. I think that it is true that there are all these scams. I'm not so sure whether if they are entirely organized crime. Probably there is organized crime, but above all, there are lots of opportunistic, ill-intended individuals on both sides of the border, in Mexico and in Canada, that are basically taking advantage of this legitimate wish to come to Canada, or taking advantage of the need of Canada for labor. Probably there may be cases also of organized crime, but more than that, I think what Graeme is the key. The vaccine against that, now that is in common use the term vaccine, so let me use it. The vaccine against these scams is information and awareness. That people in Mexico, and something together with the Canadians, we are always trying to convey, to pass along the message, to create awareness. Mexicans that want to come, it's possible to come to Canada. It is easy to come to Canada. There are schemes to come to Canada. Canada is very generous on that. Just follow the rules. If you understand that, if you understand the rules, you will not fall trapped in the hands of these people or groups scamming and defrauding people, because that's exactly what it is. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to combat them. It's very difficult to persecute them because these are weird entities on the internet. And we are trying to do that as well. But the real cure, again, as I said, the real protection against that is awareness. When people are aware, they don't fall in the hands of these totally ill-intended people. Ill-will people, not only intended.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This was our last question. So before we go to closing remarks, I will ask everyone, no matter what your hair looks like right now, to turn on your camera. We're just going to take a quick picture just to remember this amazing conversation.
Just one question, I'm sorry. Aren't there any more questions? Maybe we could take one or two if there were, just not to leave them in the buzón. I'm just asking.
I don't believe, I'm sorry, we have time for that.
No, we don't have questions.
We don't have any more questions.
Okay, perfect.
Unless there is someone.
It's more than time were the questions, but if there are no questions, perfect.
I'll just open the floor for anyone to speak up at this point if you would like to ask a question. One last one.
Okay, picture.
No, that's okay. Well, you can
Perfect.
just turn on your cameras and we can take a lovely picture to remember this moment. And then we'll go to some closing remarks before we leave for today. Say cheese, fromage. Perfect. Thank you very much. So thank you to both Ambassador Clark and Ambassador Gómez Camacho for joining us today. Youth that we've discussed have been disproportionately affected and will continue to be affected by the fallout of the pandemic. It's essential to hear from youth in both countries and around the world to address the concerns of economic resiliency in both domestic and global societies. We have also heard today from topics of human rights, the environment, and the preservation of international norms and protections for young people. Thank you to the teams at both embassies for organizing this discussion, and to you, our lovely audience, for making this possible. We hope that you found this discussion helpful in addressing your questions and concerns, and that it provided a deeper understanding of the Mexican and Canadian friendship. We hope that you will join us for future events and that you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Gracias por participar. Tengan un excelente día.
Gracias a todos. Thank you very much.
Gracias. What a pleasure. Hasta pronto.
Nos vemos. Chao.